IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we share the journey of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners.
Hey guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories. Hope you're all well and keeping safe. On the podcast today, we have columnist and author Anmol Jain sharing snippets from his wonderful book, Wanderings in the Land of Mist, the complete story of Mussoorie. As a part of the episode, we'll be giving away 2 copies of Anmol's book. Listen to the conversation and answer 3 simple questions linked in the description of the episode, and stand a chance to win. Let's hop onto the episode and find out more about the Queen of Hills, Mussoorie. So with that introduction, we'd love to welcome Anmol Jain, columnist and author of Wanderings in the Land of Mist, the complete story of Mussoorie. Anmol, thank you so much for being a part of the Musafir Stories and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Saif. And it's a pleasure being part of your podcast. And I've been going through your channel and I found some very interesting podcasts over there and some very interesting stories about different towns of India. It was very, very interesting to go through that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anmol. Firstly, congratulations on your book. I had a great time reading it and virtually walking through the streets of Mussoorie and finding out about the history of Mussoorie. And it's also great timing that we're doing this roughly 200 years after the town was founded. So really looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about this. And I'm also really pleased that we are getting this as a first-hand account, right, from a native, from somebody who is from Mussoorie. So that is an added bonus, the cherry on top of the cake. So really looking forward to this conversation. But before we get into any specifics, the intro I gave about you was pretty brief and concise. Do you want to add a few more lines about yourself and your connection with Mussoorie?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I'm a 4th generation resident of Mussoorie. My great-grandfather came here in 1901. And so my son is the fifth generation here. So basically, I've been born and brought up in Mussoorie. I did my schooling and my graduation from Mussoorie. And by qualification, I'm an MBA from one of the premier management institutes of the country in Bhopal. And then I work as a development consultant to earn my livelihood. And I also write for the Times of India. And then because I had a flair for writing and about kind of a deep connection with the history of Mussoorie, because I've been hearing stories from my father and from my grandfather about the town, that this town used to be like this, and these were the stories. So these stories I have been imbibing since my childhood, and based on whatever I've got from them, I started collecting a lot of memorabilia, and my grandfather's collection was a great collection of old pictures, old stamps, and other things. So based on that, I had become a collector till in 2018, when I thought, let me write something. So I decided to write a small blog of about 15 pages, which I could circulate amongst my friends, as a closed circulation, which would be contain a capsule about the history of Mussoorie. And then I started writing the blog and then started doing some research and finally ended up doing 250 pages. So that is how the book has transpired over the past 5 years.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Anmol. And yeah, it is a really delightful book and a captivating read about the 200-year, I don't know if I should say old or young history of Mussoorie, but it's a very colorful history, I could say. And the book certainly does justice in bringing that to the reader. Now, just going back, talking a little bit more about the origins of the town, can you speak a little bit more to that, Anmol, like how this town came into being, who founded it? There's a few very good instances and chapters in the book that talk to this.
Yeah, sure. Actually, incidentally, this year we celebrated 200 years of Mussoorie, and there was a huge celebration this year in the month of May. And Mussoorie is believed to have been founded in 1823. When the first construction was done in Mussoorie, and its founders were Captain Frederick Young and Mr. Frederick Shore. Frederick Young was a young captain in the British Army, and Frederick Shore was the superintendent of Dehradun. Dehradun is the district under which Mussoorie is located, and that time also this area was under Dehradun only. So these two gentlemen, because Britishers are very fond of their shikars and of they call it game generally. So they came up these hills in search of game, and from Dehradun, Mussoorie is barely about 7-8 miles climb uphill. So they thought, okay, these are wonderful hills and very green and well forested. So let us go up in search of game. So sometime in 1823, these two gentlemen came up to the hills of Mussoorie, and where there were some villages, and that's all. Otherwise, there was no habitation of any kind apart from a few hutments. So they came up these hills, and they found the place to be very, very cool as compared to Dehradun, also offering wonderful views of the Himalayas towards the north and the Dehradun Valley, Doon Valley towards the south, and also having a lot of game. That is what they came here for. So they built a shooting box. They built a shooting box in Mussoorie. Captain Young built a shooting box which was made of some wood and it was not a concrete structure, just made from wood and other things. So again, in my book, I have broken this myth, because people say that all the old guides and everybody, old records show that the shooting box was built somewhere on the Camel's Back hill. But actually, through my book and through my research, I found that the shooting box was built near the Christchurch facing the Mall Road. That is another thing we'll discuss maybe in the further part of this interview. But the point is that in 1823, the first construction was done in Mussoorie, and after that, number of houses came. The first Pakka house was Zephyr Cottage. Then came Captain Young's house called Mullingar, and then Leopard Lodge and Sir George Everest House. So there was 8 or 9 houses in Mussoorie by the end of 1830. So this is how the town started to develop. But actually, if you look at it from a historical perspective, 1823 was not the point where the Britishers or the Goras first came up to Mussoorie Hills. The first record that I was able to find about Englishmen climbing these hills was 1808, when a party of surveyors came up these hills, and they had the first view of the western Himalayan ranges from the Landour area in Mussoorie. And because this was a very interesting search party that had climbed up to Mussoorie from Dehradun and nearby, because they were trying to find the source of the river Ganges. And it was believed that the Ganges came from somewhere in Tibet, and from Tibet there was a pass, and through the pass the Ganges flowed to Uttarakhand and it came down. Uttarakhand was not a name which was in parlance at that point of time. So from there it flowed down through the Gangotri and down to Haridwar. So they were a party of 3 British gentlemen. One of them was Haider Jung Hersey, who was whose family later resided in Mussoorie. So these people wanted to find the source of the Ganges. So the first hill that they climbed was the Mussoorie Hills, and then they went further beyond. And later on, it came to know later that Ganges originates from the Gaumukh. That is another story. So that was the first party. Then again, we have recorded evidence of a second party of Britishers who came to these hills. That is in 1814, and there is a rock inscription at Bhadraj, outside Bhadraj, where it is written the names of all these British gentlemen who came, and 1814 is also written. So basically, Mussoorie can trace his origins way back to 1808. But for the purpose of establishment of habitation, and when the habitation started, we are saying it's 1823 when Mussoorie was established by 2 gentlemen, Frederick Young and Frederick Shore. Both were Fredericks. And then since then, now we have completed 200 years, and the Queen, like you said, is not aging. I think the Queen might be aging, but it is aging gracefully. So, because we call Mussoorie the Queen of the Hills. So the Queen is aging gracefully, or maybe adding a few silver hairs to her scalp. But I think we're doing pretty well as a town.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And there's a few, like you mentioned, very, very interesting historical tidbits covered as a part of the origin story of Mussoorie as well. So thank you for sharing those with us on the podcast too, Anmol. But going back in time, right, even before the 1800s, when this British influx, or not even influx, the beginning of the story of Mussoorie started, right, when they came here looking for game and appreciated it because of its weather and its cool climate.
Yeah.
There has been life here and folklore here and smaller villages in and around the area for a long time. And you have mentioned some of those very interesting folklore, especially around Lord Balram in this area as well. Would you want to shed some light on that incident?
Sure. That is a very interesting, part of the history of Mussoorie, which is not talked about by the historians and in many books. Actually, as I said earlier, that there were small hutments on these hills because the area was not, completely inhabited. There were local people, local villagers living here in many small settlements around this area. So one such settlement is towards the west end of the Mussoorie ridge. You see, Mussoorie is a 7-kilometer long ridge. It is a ridge on the top of the lower Himalayan range, and so towards the west of this Mussoorie ridge, or towards the west of where we have the main town of Mussoorie, we had a very high point of hill called, which is more than 7,000 feet above sea level, which is now called the Bhadraj hill. And Bhadraj had a few villages around it. The folklores say that the Bhadraj hill was the place where Lord Balram, because if we go back to Mahabharata times, Lord Balram did not participate in Mahabharata, although Lord Krishna did, but Balram did not participate, and so he, excused himself from the war, and he came came to this high hill at Bhadraj, which he liked, the place he liked, because on one side it offers a majestic view of the Himalayan ranges, and towards the south it offers a wonderful view of the Doon Valley, stretching right up to the Shiva Lakes. So he decided to settle here and meditate and do and just excuse himself from the Mahabharata battle. So he stayed there for many years, and during that time the local villagers used to come to him. They thought that he's a saint, and Lord Balram taught them a lot of things about agriculture, about cow rearing, and also helped them with many things like teaching them warfare also. So then when Mahabharata ended, Balram decided to go back. So villagers who had become very fond of him, they started crying, they started persuading him not to go away. So Balram said, "Don't worry, I am going away for the moment, but I'll come back after some years." Then many years later, I don't know, maybe a century later or maybe more or less, there is no historical evidence to say that, a villager called Nandu Mehra, who was living, because Yamuna flows right behind Bhadraj, is a god where Yamuna flows. So Nandu Mehra was a villager residing in a village on the banks of Yamuna, and at that time they used to dig for roots. So he was digging for roots of a plant called taro, which they call it locally. Colocasus is the botanical name. So he was digging for these roots, and so suddenly he struck something, which was very hard. So he removed the mud. He thought, I have come across a very big root. He became very happy with his luck. I have struck a very big root. So he dug more, and he started digging, and he found something very hard, much harder than a root. So Nandu thought, maybe I have struck a treasure here. He dug more, and then he was able to unearth a large idol. Now he could not place that whose idol was it, because he said, this does not look like Shiva idol. This does not look like a Vishnu idol. Whose idol it is? So he was, kept the idol on the ground, and he was standing near it and contemplating. So suddenly he heard a voice, which said, "Nandu Mehra, you have to take me. You have to pick up my idol. I am God, and you have to pick up my idol and take me up the hill." Nandu got very scared, but finally he gathered his wits and managed to pick up the idol. And as soon as Nandu tried to pick up the idol, it was as light as a feather. So he walked for, quite a long distance. He climbed up the hill, and suddenly he said that I am feeling thirsty. So the idol said, "Don't worry, go a little bit further up the hill, and then I will guide you to a place where you can get very fresh water to quench your thirst." So the idol guided him, the voice guided him that, at one point he just removed a little bit of mud and there was a wonderful spring started flowing from there and he was able to drink, and he had never drank such a good water in his whole life. It was so refreshing, such a refreshing water. And that spring is still there at a village called Matongi, which is just below Bhadraj. And then Landour started walking up, and finally he reached the top of the hill, and suddenly the idol became very, very heavy. And he dropped it because he could not lift it anymore, and the idol settled there. And that is the place where this temple of Lord Balram called Bhadraj temple is still there. Even after centuries, it's still there, and now it has become into a very good structure. And a lot of people visit there. The annual fair is held in the month of August, and thousands of people from Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, people gather there, and from Uttarakhand, and they say that if you ask for a wish, it is fulfilled. And in fact, the first historical record of this ancient temple I found in a book by a British travel writer whose name was Lady Fanny Parks. So Fanny Parks records on a visit to Bhadraj in 1838 that I came across a old Hindu temple, and there are some idols there, and local villagers offer their obeisance to these idols, and so that was the first record. But this temple is centuries old. And so that is an integral part of the history of Mussoorie. Although people, I don't know why historians and authors forget that and forget this interesting bit of history which is connected to Mussoorie.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what I think makes it such an interesting read as well, the book, that it has a great combination of not just some of the historical events and landmarks, but also greatly captures some of the folklore of the area and gives us a true sense of what the flavor of Mussoorie is. Now, just getting a little bit deeper into the town and the landmarks in the town and the landmark events in the town as well. Do you want to touch a little bit upon Landour as well? I know this is almost like a little town within the town of Mussoorie, right?
Exactly.
And there's a subtle plug here. We've actually done an episode on Landour in the past, so we'll link to that too. But reading again through your lens, through your view as a native there, it has been great. Do you want to just give a brief overview of what Landour is, its initial purpose, why it was set up, etc.?
Sure. See, basically, Landour, today it's part of Mussoorie, Today we consider, Mussoorie includes Landour, But Landour was actually, it developed as a separate township. So Landour was a cantonment area, military cantonment area. So we had two towns actually. You rightly said town within the town. We had two towns because Landour came up as a military area and Mussoorie came up as a civilian area. So both were separate towns. Landour was governed by the army and Mussoorie was governed by the administration, the local administration. To trace the history of Landour, we go back to 1826 when the founding father, Captain Frederick Young, he built a small cottage, which I mentioned about Malingar. He built a small cottage called Malingar. Mm-hmm. Malingar is a name of is a place in the county of Donegal, which was the hometown of Captain Young. So he named this his house as Malingar, just to remind him of his home. And also another thing about this bit is that he built a potato field just below the cottage. Because, Britishers were fond of potatoes. And in India at that point of time, you will not believe, Saf, there was no potatoes. So Captain Young brought potato seeds from Ireland. Captain Young was an Irishman. So he brought potato seeds from Ireland, and these potato seeds were sown in his potato field just below his house, so that he could get a regular supply of potatoes. And perhaps that is how the potatoes were introduced in the Western Himalayan region. So that is one bit of the story. So after Captain Young built his house and he started staying here during the summer season, he thought that this is a wonderful place and, this offers a very good climate and very soothing climate, and also at this altitude, because you see the malaria, point of time, the plains of India were infested with malaria. And all the Britishers, or a lot of Britishers used to be suffering from malaria. Some died, some suffered for some time. And the second thing that troubled them was tuberculosis. So TB and malaria were two things. Mussoorie is 6,000 meters above sea level, and Landour is at about 7,000 meters above sea level. So there is no chance of getting malaria here. And the third thing was that for tuberculosis also, treatment of tuberculosis also, this climate was considered very good. So he decided to build a convalescent depot for the erring British soldiers at Mussoorie, where they could rest, they could recuperate, because that time a lot of wars were happening with India, within India and from outside India, so the erring soldiers could come here at Landour, rest in these climates, and also get a respite from malaria. So this is how we had a convalescent home there, and gradually it developed as a military base. And in the hospital or the convalescent depot which was established there were nurses who were serving the sick and the wounded. So these nurses, they needed to fill up their daily provisions, groceries and other things. So these nurses used to shop at a place where there were few shops, and these few shops, and later on we started calling it, now we call it the Sisters Bazaar. So this is how the origin of Sisters Bazaar is. And a bit below Sisters Bazaar, as you approach towards Landour and you go past Palingar, is a place called Char Dukan. Char Dukan is named Char Dukan because there used to be, as you understand in Hindi, there were 4 shops. So it was called Char Dukan. Now they have become 7 shops, so I think we should call it Saat Dukan now. Many people have told me that why don't we call it Saat Dukan? And from Char Dukan, just beyond Char Dukan, you must have heard about the Mall Road of Mussoorie, and which is on the main picture palace and the main civilian part of the town. But Landour also had a mall road. It started just beyond Char Dukan, went a full circle, from Lal Tibba and came up to Kellogg's Church. So this was the mall road of Landour. People don't know, we call it Chakkar Ki Sadak now, circular road, but this was actually named as the mall road by the British.
Yeah, thank you for beautifully capturing that brief history and important places within Landour and how it came into being. And like I said, for people who want to listen to a full-fledged itinerary on Landour, you could always listen to our episode covered there a few years ago. Now, just talking about important people within the town of Mussoorie, as well as who are involved in the building of the town of Mussoorie. Captain Young and Captain Shore were obviously the founders, but also there were several other important people, and one name that definitely grabs most people's attention, I'm sure, is that of Sir George Everest, right? He also had spent some time here in Mussoorie and has a few important run-ins here in Mussoorie. So do you want to give a brief overview of his time here in Mussoorie and the important places like, for example, his home here in Mussoorie and what state that is in now, right, Anmol?
You see, George Everest, Sir George Everest was the Surveyor General of India, and he was also the Surveyor General of the Great Trigonometric Survey. The Great Trigonometric Survey was started by the British in the early part of the 19th century to measure the distances and the heights of the places in India, throughout the Indian subcontinent. So, Sir George Everest, being the Surveyor General, was also the head of the Great Trigonometric Survey. And it was based on the trigonometric arc or the trigonometric survey that they started, that the height of all the mountain ranges in the Himalayas were calculated, and also the height of the Mount Everest was calculated based on this survey and based on the readings taken by them through the method. Although Sir George Everest did not himself find the height of the Mount Everest, the credit goes to an Indian person who was on the post of a computer. At that time we did not have physical computers over which we are talking right now. There was a post of a computer, a human computer. Computer was somebody, a literal meaning of the word, he used to compute and used to calculate. So this gentleman was a brilliant computer, Mr. Radhanath Sikdar. So actually he calculated the height of the Everest, Mount Everest. And although the credit goes to Sir George Everest because the British were there and they were ruling us, so obviously they will not give the credit to an Indian. But Radhanath Sikdar was the person who actually computed the height of Mount Everest. That is one story. Now coming back to the connection of Sir George Everest with Mussoorie. Yes, absolutely. Like you said, Saab, that Sir George Everest was one of the most distinguished people to have stayed in Mussoorie and to have resided here. We have got a list of people who were noted people who stayed here, but George Everest was definitely count amongst the top notch of that list because of his connection with the Mount Everest and because Mount Everest was named after him. So George Everest came to Mussoorie in 1832. So there was a house which is called the Park Estate. Even today it is called the Park Estate. It was a 800-acre estate, huge estate. Amidst very, very thick forest, there was little habitation nearby. And there was a lone house on that ridge, which is located, even today, it is about 7 or 8 kilometers from the main town of Mussoorie. And that, so it was very far away from Mussoorie. And that time, Mussoorie was even smaller. So it may have been, a bit of a trouble for him to commute from his house to Mussoorie. But I think they liked the serenity and they liked the greenery and they liked to stay alone. This house, which was wonderfully located, but this house was away from any kind of water source. It was far away from any regular supply of water. Everest had built an underground reservoir below his house, which is still there. Some parts of it can still be seen, and the water from used to be, collected in the reservoir, and then from the reservoir it used to be taken to the household of Everest. So this is how he came here, and from 1832 till 1843, for 11 years, he stayed in the same house. And then this was basically a summer house for him because the main head office of Survey of India, still today, the national head office of Survey of India is in Dehradun. So during the winter months, Everett used to migrate with his staff and everybody else to the Dehradun office. And during the summer months, he used to come up to Mussoorie with his staff, and he had an observatory built near the house, from where he used to do mathematical calculations and whatever observations he used to do about the heights of mountains and heights of places. So this is what his connection has been. And one more thing I'd like to add, that although he stayed here for 11 years, but he was constantly at loggerheads with our founding father, Captain Frederick Young. So Young was 4 years senior to him in the army, and as you know, Everest was also an army man. But both of them were constantly fighting about small things, and mostly about small things, and not fighting with some kind of swords or some kind of guns, but fighting over the pen. So Young would send a letter to Everest, and Everest would reply to that letter, and he would scold Young. So this is how things happened, and then finally, at the end of every battle, Young had to concede, and Young had to apologize or had to give in to Everest, because Everest was very, very belligerent and very, very headstrong person. And then in 1843, when Everest went back to England, he left his house for sale, and then finally his house was sold after 17 years. In 1860, his house was sold to subsequent people, and then finally, after independence, it was transferred to an Indian family who lived there for some years, and they are good friends of mine. And the gentleman who is now nearing 80 said that I was a child when I moved in the house, and we used to see leopards roaming around the house, and we used to hear the calls of the hyenas, and we used to see wolves and bear roaming around the house. So this is how it was. And then finally the property was sold to the Department of Tourism, and recently, about a few years ago, with the help of Asian Development Bank, the tourism department has revamped the dilapidated house of Sir George Everest and made a cartography museum there, which is the first cartography museum in the country. And it has all equipments of Everest. His bust has been placed there. A bust of Radha Ratsikdar, Nansing, who was again an Indian surveyor. All these things have been kept there. So thankfully, there is some history is being preserved through that cartography museum, and a lot of tourists are going there. That place is frequented by tourists.
Yeah, some very, very interesting historical facts as well as facts from the life of Sir George Everest, and even this bit about the human computer that you mentioned, right? The person the Indian person who actually did most of the computing and the calculation. That it was my first time coming across that fact too. So thank you for sharing some really, really interesting tidbits like that. And while we are talking about some important people and personalities who have connections with Mussoorie, I thought we could also cover off a couple other important names or interesting names that I came across. Even though the famous hunter Jim Corbett, he wasn't from here, but he has a little connection to Mussoorie that I'm sure, Anmol, you want to touch upon?
Yeah, he's got a strong connection to Mussoorie. Actually, his father, Christopher Corbett, was a postmaster in the Landour post office. So he was a postmaster here, and his mother, Jane Mary, was married. She had a first marriage, and then her family, her husband was killed during the mutiny in Agra. So she moved to Mussoorie to, take some time out, just, get her life together. And so there, while she went to post the letters in the post office, she met Christopher Corbett and they fell in love. And so she remarried Christopher Corbett. And then their son was Jim Corbett, the illustrious hunter turned conservationist Jim Corbett. And this couple was also married at a church in Mussoorie, which is at Char Dukan. St. Paul's Church at Char Dukan. It was at that place where the couple was married. And later on, after staying for a few years in Mussoorie, the postmaster was transferred to Nainital. And so they shifted to Nainital, and finally, because we get all the accounts of Jim Corbett from Nainital, hunting around Nainital. so I think, but Mussoorie has also got a small piece of the history. And so, but the family ultimately settled there. So Jim Corbett has all his exploits around Kaladungi and Nainital and the forest in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my most favorite people, and I love reading his books and listening to his books. So I thought I'd definitely bring that up during our conversation. From one of my most favorite person to probably one of the people I hate more or most as well as General Dyer, right? And he potentially, or he or his family also had a connection to Mussoorie. Would you like to touch upon that too, Anmol?
Yeah, he also had a connection to Mussoorie. In fact, I also don't like that gentleman, but because his family had a connection here, so I call him and as we all call it, the butcher of Jallianwala. So basically, his uncle, his father's elder brother, John Dyer, was a barrister, and he was residing in Mussoorie. He used to practice from Mussoorie. So his father, General Dyer's father, Edward Dyer, he was in England in the early 1850s, and so John called, and Mussoorie at that time by the 1850 had a very, very good brewery business, making beer out of, because we had so many springs, and so making beer from the water of these springs, which was a very, very profitable business, which continued till 1910. So John Dyer called Edward Dyer from England, and he said, and Edward came in and he said, why don't you start this brewery business here at Mussoorie? It's such a profitable business and you must do this. So at that time, Edward Dyer did not set up his brewery here, but he went to Kasauli, which is in Himachal Pradesh, and he set up the Dyer Brewery in Himachal Pradesh in 1857. So that Dyer Brewery came up in Himachal Pradesh, but he had a connection to Mussoorie. And interestingly, very, very interestingly, have you heard of the Mohan Mekin beer? The beer by Mohan, the Golden Eagle beer by Mohan Mekin Breweries. I think a lot of our readers must have heard of it. The first beer to come in India was the Golden Eagle beer. And people used to really relish it. And they had no choice, obviously. It was the only beer that was manufactured in India. So General Dyer's brewery later on became the Mohan Mekin Brewery. And that brewery is still continuing of making a number of beer and whiskies, which is now based at Ghaziabad near Delhi. So this was how the General Dyer came to Mussoorie, and then he set up his brewery. And again, one more fact that in 1867, a brewery came up in Mussoorie called the Murch and Dyer Brewery, Messrs. MURCH, Murch and Dyer Brewery. So I believe that was set up in Mussoorie by the father of General Dyer. So that is what his connection to Mussoorie has been. I'm glad that it's not been a larger or stronger connection, because that would have been very, very hateful for the town.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, from my most favorite Jim Corbett to perhaps my least favorite John Dyer. But yeah, I think connections like these also kind of give you that feeling of world is a small place, right? There's like different connections that you are almost unaware of, and coming across them in a breezy reading like this is just so pleasurable. And while we're talking about brews and breweries, I know Mussoorie has its own set of different breweries that came up, and also has a connection to the IPA, the Indian Pale Ale.
Indian Pale Ale.
That also has a connection, right?
Yeah, sure. This is very interesting point you brought up, Seth, because I have a chapter in my book called The Cheers for the Tipplers. So that is all about the breweries here. And in fact, in Mussoorie, brewing was the first business that came up in Mussoorie. And in fact, on the hills of India, first time brewery was introduced at Mussoorie in 1830 by a gentleman called Henry Bole. But he had to close down his brewery by 1832 because he had went to a tiff with Colonel Young, and then later on his son-in-law John Mackinnon set up another brewery, and then we got a third brewery which was at the site of the Merchant Dyer Brewery called the Crown Brewery. So by 1901, the breweries of Mussoorie were producing hundreds of gallons of beer, and were employing hundreds of people. And the beer of Mussoorie had such a great reputation that it was being served to all the major cantonments of North India, right from Ludhiana to Jabalpur to Meerut to Dehradun. All these cantonments were getting beer from Mussoorie. So this is how the brewing thing was there. And one of the interesting bits was that, like you asked about IPA, basically before the brewing started in India, so the British used to import their beer because they are fond of beer. So they import the beer from England, which used to come via ships. But during the long ship voyage, the constant jerk of the ships and also the change in temperature, the beer used to turn sour. So basically that is why they could not relish the beer coming from abroad, and so that is why the brewery business, they wanted to set up their own local beer. And so this is how Henry Bole, who was a brewer and distiller, his distillery was at Meerut, he came to the hills and started up the brewery business here. And this is how brewing profited. And the reason for the settlement of breweries in the hills was that at the higher temperature, the hops that they used to put in the beer to ferment it, they used to stay. They did not get bad or did not get sour, and so that is how the Mussoorie beer became so popular. But now it is history, because by 1915 the brewing business in Mussoorie had stopped, and one of the reasons that people give, which many people give, was that in one of the breweries they used to have vats. Vats were large containers in which beer was filled, and it was so basically in one of the large container or one of the vat called vat number 69. Again, this is not the same vat 69, but vat number 69 was the name of that container. When that container emptied, they found a human skeleton. So was the taste of the beer coming from the human skeleton, or was it just an accident? But nobody knows. But then finally, gradually, beer brewing in Mussoorie stopped. And maybe that was also the time when the refrigerators came to the plains and they were able to start up refrigerated drinks. So hills had no use for beer brewing. So it could be either of the two. And but then the brewing stopped in Mussoorie by that time.
Yeah, but yeah, Mussoorie has had its connection to brews and breweries, and cheers for the tipplers, like you said, right? So I think that's another remarkable chapter. I think somewhat connected to this is also the image of Mussoorie as the pleasure capital of the Raj, right? It has been known like this, as well as the Queen of Hills for a while. Do you want to shed some light on that aspect too, like how it came about being the pleasure capital of the Raj?
Yeah, that is actually very interesting, and now it is today the pleasure capital of India. So from the pleasure capital of Raj, because now So basically, I'll go back to the 19th century. I spoke about the salubrious climate that we had in Mussoorie, and the soldiers came here on sick leave and on furlough. And also, because the biggest thing tormenting the British was the heat of the plains. They could not bear the heat of the plains, which was quite unlike the climate that they had come from. Mussoorie, they started gradually as soldiers started coming up and merchants started coming up. People thought that this is a wonderful place to be in during the harsh summers of the plains, of Indian plains. But the problem was that the British soldiers were, those who got leave, they came to Mussoorie, but a lot of them did not get a leave and they were staying in the plains. So they started sending their families, their wives and children up to Mussoorie during the summer, so that at least these people can get some respite from the harsh summers of the plains. So the women started coming up, some with their children, some who did not have children, they started coming up alone. Later on, these women were called as the grass widows. Grass widows because they were married, but they were not coming with their husbands, and they were coming to Mussoorie alone, and so they were called as grass widows. And there was married women and unmarried women as well who started coming up. So and there were the young Tommies, who were around. The Tommies were the British soldiers. They were around, and some were married and some were unmarried again. So a lot of liaisons started developing between these British women, married and unmarried, and as well as the British men, the British soldiers who were around here. And also we had a lot of breweries which were serving a lot of beer. There were a lot of bars, so you could go and have a beer at any place, and you could roam around on the mall. And there was a lot of social gatherings happening around the town. So they were meeting each other on the mall road or at the social gatherings, and so they were developing closeness. So much so that at a hotel called the Savoy Hotel in Mussoorie, it's recorded evidence in some of the old books. At sunrise, an old porter who could barely see, he used to walk around the corridors ringing a bell, and this was called the separation bell. So he walked in the corridor ringing a bell so that the pious could say their prayers. Note my words, the pious could say their prayers and the impious could go back to their own rooms. So you can imagine the kind of liaisons that were happening there. That they had to invent a separation bell. Because they did not, for the image of the Raj, they did not want married women to be seen with another gentleman. So this bell was invented so that people could go back to their own rooms at sunrise. And so this is how it was the pleasure capital of the Raj, because you could, have fun of all kind of things. And there's a lot of incidents. There was one incident where a British lady stood up on the mall road, stood up on a chair and said, I'm auctioning my kisses. One kiss for $5 or five pounds, whatever. And so she was able to make some money out of it. And then later on, there was a lot of hue and cry. What is our society coming to? And once in the Christchurch, the priest also gave a sermon to all to the gentry who was gathered at the church, that what are we doing with our society? What have we come to? We are drinking freely. Then kisses are being auctioned. What are we doing? We should, kind of restrict our society and become more moral. So this is the pleasure capital had become to such extent that the church or the priest had to give a sermon to the gentleman. So this is why we also used to call it the pleasure capital of the Raj. And coming to present time, such liaisons may or may not be there, but definitely people come here to relax, to drink, to have fun. So we are still the pleasure capital in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And some really great stories that make up this chapter too, about how Mussoorie turned into the pleasure capital of the Raj. And that's why I wasn't surprised after going through these that there was a point called as Scandal Point, right? Or there was a place called as Scandal Point within Mussoorie. And thinking about it, now you can clearly make the connections. And talking about some important landmarks and important points within the town as well, and some stories they have, some of them are pretty unique. No hill station story is complete without its fair share of haunted stories or legends and tales like that, right? And Mussoorie has its own fair share of it, starting from the Telis or the human oil extractors to Nachne Wali Mem, right? And the story of the haunting of the Nachne Wali Mem. Do you want to touch upon those two stories quickly, Anmol?
Yeah, sure. The story of Telis is very, very interesting and perhaps very, very embarrassing for the Britishers in a way, because these Telis, as I've written in the book, these were basically, they were called Telis. Tel is, oil in Hindi. And these people used to extract human oil. And when I first heard about this story from my grandfather and many of his friends, I did not believe it. I said, this is some kind of a, folklore you are creating or some kind of urban legend you are trying to create. This can't be possible. But I believed it later on when I read a journal of a British lady around 1878. I am forgetting the name of the lady. It's there in my book. She wrote that because of some fear of some kind of human oil extractors, the local population, especially the working class or the blue-collared people from Mussoorie, are migrating and running away. And for several years they ran away until the Britishers were able to restore their confidence back and get people to work for them in Mussoorie. And all these people ran away because these Telis were, crawling about the hills at night. And what they used to do, and this is a story which has been told to me by a doctor, and he was about 90 years old when he told me this story. He's no more now. And this is a story of the 1840s, when the doctor was pounced upon by a few of the men clad in black robes, short men, and apparently they were the Telis who pounced upon him and tried to, tie him and carry him away. When he shouted that I am a doctor, they checked up his bag, and in his bag they definitely found equipment of a doctor. So they left him. So basically these Telis were trying to, take away all the blue-collared men or the working class, and what they used to do to them was they used to hang them upside down over a fire. And apparently some kind of oil used to come down from their brain, through their brain, and the person used to die, but the oil used to flow down from the brain, and this oil was collected. And this was apparently what people have told me that used to treat wounds of the British soldiers during the wars, the First World War and Second World War. And this is how the Teli used to roam above the town at night. And second one was about the Nachne Wali Mem. It was supposed to be a haunting story, but in the end, it was something else, because there's a friend of mine, or a senior of mine, I would say, he's in the 70s, called Mr. Agarwal, Digvijay Agarwal. He lives in a very isolated bungalow outside Mussoorie, old British mansion called Cloud's End. So he narrated this story to me. He said that in the 80s, he went to his bungalow and because his chowkidar had ran away, so he went to his bungalow to make sure that everything was all right. The people that he met, they said, "Sir, beware, there's this Nachne Wali Mem. Mem is a British lady, Nachne Wali Mem around, and she might trouble you." So this gentleman, he said, I kept because there was no electricity in his bungalow at that point of time, so he said, I kept out candles and I kept my torch, and I also kept my loaded revolver near me, and I slept soundly. And sometime in the middle of the night, maybe after 12, he woke up to a rustling sound coming from somewhere in his house. He was alone in the house, so he was a bit alarmed, because obviously the villagers had also told him that there is a Nachne Wali Mem prowling about the house. So, but then the sound stopped, and then he tried to sleep. Then after a few minutes, he again heard the rustling sound. Again, he was alarmed. Finally, he picked up his revolver, his torch, and went around the house, looking for the source of this sound. He could not find any source, but what resulted was that throughout the night he kept sitting and could not sleep, because he was trying to find out the source of the sound and also trying to find out whether there is this Nachne Wali Mem or this ghost of this lady around. So in the morning, when there was some sunlight, he went outside the house and he said, where was this rustling sound coming from? Going a bit ahead, he found that there was this creeper which has grown against his bedroom window, and the leaves of the plant were making a rustling sound against the window when the wind was blowing. So this was the Nachne Wali Mem story. But he has not come across the meme after that. He's still living in the house. He spent 40,
Okay.
but he has not come across. His daughters are also there, but thankfully they have not come across this lady. But he really wants to meet this lady. He really wants to.
Yeah, I think a lot of very, very colorful stories like these is what make the book so enjoyable, and I would definitely encourage listeners to check it out to get a full experience of the different stories related to Mussoorie. Now, as we start to wrap up the conversation, any other points of interest or stories that really stayed with you or shocked you or surprised you while you were going through your process of coming up with the book, Anmol, that you'd like to share?
One more hilarious story of the 70s. Maybe the listeners would, like the story. This is the late 70s. We have a very old hotel called the Hackman's Hotel. This was a very, very happening place, which is located right on the Mall Road. And this is a story about a gentleman who's still around. I have named him as Mr. X in my book because I'm afraid that if I give his name, then it will create a lot of problems for me. So I've just put Mr. X. So Mr. X was in the late 70s, was a student leader and had a reputation of being a very, very belligerent individual and very tall and handsome. And so Mr. X was one day roaming around the Mall Road. He had a couple of drinks. He was very, very fond of his drinks. So he came to a place called Jhulaghar, a little bit before Hackman's, and he came to and at that time horses used to ply on the Mall Road. They were stopped about 10 years ago, but horses used to ply at that time. And we had these horse wallahs who were standing and holding the rein of the horse, and they would, ask tourists to pay them 100 or 50 rupees for a horse ride. So Mr. X saw the horses and thought, okay, let me take a horse ride. And he was already a bit high, a bit tipsy. He beckoned one of the horse person, come here. Within seconds, he was on top of the horse and he was riding right up to Gandhi Chowk, which was about 1.5 kilometers from the place where he picked up his horse. So he went up to Gandhi Chowk and riding very, very fast, and everybody was cantering away, trying to get away from the horse because he would have trampled them. So he went up to Gandhi Chowk and then returned towards the place from where he had picked up the horse. And on the way, he heard live band playing in the Hackman's Hotel. And he thought, oh my God, I have never had a drink in Hackman's. Let me have one drink at Hackman's. So he turned his horse towards Hackman's. And Hackman's was, it had, when you approach the Hackman's Hotel, it still has 5 or 6 stairs going down from the Mall Road, and then you have this their main dining hall where orchestra was playing. So he tried to take his horse. He tried to enter the hotel on his horse. So there was an old guard standing at the gate of the hotel. He tried to stop him, but our Mr. X gave one solid kick to the guard, and guard fell and he became unconscious. And Mr. X, put his head down like we have the Clint Eastwood movies. We have got the hero, clinging to the mane of the horse and trying to evade bullets coming from behind him, and so he ducked and he took his horse down the stairs and he entered the dining hall of Hackman's, and everybody was scared, and there were ladies and gentlemen sitting there having their drinks, and some people doing dancing, and there was the orchestra playing, and everybody ran away. And so finally the poor manager, he had to do this. He came to Mr. X because he also knew for such what kind of a dangerous this guy is, and how dangerous he becomes, especially when he's a bit high. So he came to him. He said, "Yes, sir, how can I help you?" So this fellow got down from the horse. "I want your best scotch." And he sat on one of the table and he said, "Park my ride." This is what exactly he said. The manager told me, "Park my ride." So his horse was taken outside in the hotel and he got a drink. And then as soon as the glass came in front of me, he said, "Where is the orchestra? I want some music." So the musicians were called back on the stage again, and music played. Solo performance for Mr. X. There was nobody else. Nobody else dared enter the hall. And he had his drink. And then he told the man, "Check please." So check came, he paid the bill. He dutifully paid his bill. And then he got up. So he said, "Where is my ride?" So manager said, sir, it is waiting outside. He said, no, I came up till here to bring my horse here. So the horse came inside and then he went on his horse outside Hackman's, on his horse. So this was perhaps the only time when a horse entered Hackman's. And so this is another very interesting and very hilarious story, which I love narrating this story because this is one of my personal favorites,
Hilarious and seems right out of a movie, right? And I guess that's why they say movies are real, right? Because you never know, movies might have been inspired by an incident like this. But the book is full of very colorful and interesting incidents and events and people like this. So I think that's what I cherished a lot about the book too, Anmol, is that it's not just about a place and important places, why it's beautiful or why it's historic. It's not that. It's the stories that also enrich the reading so much more. And I really enjoyed reading the book and knowing the history of Mussoorie.
Thank you so much.
Anmol, again, it's been a really exciting time just talking to you and hearing all of this through you. I know the episode itself has been a little different in terms of it not being necessarily about an itinerary, about places to go visit and see. But worry not, Anmol has you covered there as well, because the book has a wonderful coverage towards the end where he has listed out some of the important places and given very useful QR codes for those places too. That'll take you right to those on a map, so you don't have to worry about the important places to cover off in an itinerary when you're visiting Mussoorie, and perhaps reliving some of these stories, right? And having a little chuckle as you pass through some of these historic places and events that took place in this very beautiful town and the land of the mist, like Anmol calls it, right? So make sure to check out the book. The book is Wanderings in the Land of Mist, the complete story of Mussoorie. Thank you so much, Anmol. It was a pleasure having you on the Musafir Stories.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure was all mine.
That was yet another great episode on the Musafir Stories. Make sure to show us some love by sharing the podcast with your friends and family. We are on Instagram and Twitter at Musafir Stories. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM podcast app or the website. Follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram.